Day 474, Thursday, July 25th. Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31, 1-31, NKJV. The words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him. What, my son? And what, son of my womb? And what, son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women, nor your ways to that which destroys kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law, and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to those who are bitter of heart. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his misery no more. Open your mouth for the speechless, in the cause of all who are appointed to die. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. Who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax, and willingly works with her hands. She is like the merchant ships, she brings her food from afar. She also rises while it is yet night, and provides food for her household, and a portion for her maidservants. She considers a field and buys it. From her profits she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength, and strengthens her arms. She perceives that her merchandise is good, and her lamp does not go out by night. She stretches out her hands to the distaff, and her hand holds the spindle. She extends her hand to the poor, yes, she reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household is clothed with scarlet. She makes tapestry for herself, her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies sashes for the merchants. Strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. She watches over the ways of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. Daily Deep Dive. The UCG reading plan states, it was noted in previous comments that chapters 30 and 31 are two distinct but related sections, each apparently with two subsections, 4 parts in all. As stated before, some ties between the two chapters may indicate that they should be read together. We will note some of these again as we proceed. 1. Subheading, Proverbs 31:1. As with Agur, some have thought that King Lemuel, this name meaning devoted to God or belonging to God, repeated in verse 4, is a pseudonym for Solomon. Yet, as was pointed out in regard to Agur, it seems odd that Solomon would go by another name here considering the clear mentions of his name elsewhere in the book of Proverbs. It is true that he goes by the title of preacher in Ecclesiastes, but his name Solomon is not used elsewhere in that book. Some argue that Proverbs 30 and 31 being separate compositions only later appended to the book of Proverbs could explain this. However, we might then wonder why the later compilers did not clarify Solomon as the author of these sections, in line with his name being used elsewhere in Proverbs. Unless, of course, they did not know. Clearly, the matter is strictly a guess either way, but an author other than Solomon seems perhaps more likely. Lemuel, like Agur, could well be a pseudonym, but not necessarily for Solomon. Perhaps it was a nickname for this king used particularly by his mother. Some maintain that Lemuel was a foreigner. As in Proverbs 31, the word in Proverbs 31 translated utterance in the NKJV, or oracle in the NIV, is massa, the Hebrew word meaning burden, used frequently by Israel's prophets to denote a message from God either because it was carried by them or was heavy or weighty. It was pointed out previously that the word occurs in Proverbs 31 without the definite article, a fact some used to support this being the name of a country over which Lemuel was king, especially as there was Amasa son of Ishmael, Genesis 5:13-16, 1 Chronicles 1:29-31, whose descendants were probably the Arabian tribe of that name recorded in Assyrian documents. This opinion is buttressed by the arrangement of the words here in the original Hebrew. Dabari Lemuel Melech Massa. Words Lemuel King Massa. it being unusual to say Lemuel king, rather than the king Lemuel or Lemuel the king, unless the word to follow was the name of a land or people. However, recall the use of the definite article with massa, ha-massa, in Proverbs 31, which makes more sense as the burden, i.e. the born or weighty message, than as the name of a country. And it is likely that massa is meant in the same sense in Proverbs 31. Why then, is there no definite article in the latter case? In the Hebrew, the adjective asher, meaning that, comes immediately after the word massa here, which can serve to make the sense definite rather than indefinite. The subheading should probably be read this way: Words of Lemuel, king, a weighty message that his mother taught him. Of course, this gets us no closer to knowing who Lemuel was. We know only that he was a king. Whether of Israel or a related people is not clear. Those who contend he was Solomon maintain that Solomon's mother Bathsheba was the source of the instruction here. Yet again, that is indeterminate and seems unlikely. Whatever the case, it was the king's mother who taught him what is written here. Some label her the queen mother, but she could have been a lesser royal wife who died before her son ascended the throne. And Lemuel's mother may not have actually written what we read here. Lemuel himself, or another commissioned by him, may have summarized her lifelong instructions in literary form. How much of the chapter should be attributed to Lemuel's mother, or to one who summarized her teaching? Some regard only verses 2 to 9, meant specifically as instructions for a king, as constituting her counsel. They view the poem of the virtuous wife in verses as the product of someone else entirely, an independent, concluding unit to the book of Proverbs. Yet given the absence of a new subheading at verse 10, it seems more natural to view the latter part of the chapter, even though it is unquestionably a distinct unit in itself, as the concluding part of Lemuel's mother's instructions, though again, someone else could have turned her advice into the remarkable poem here. Of course, being part of Lemuel's mother's counsel does not preclude this poem from also being used as an epilogue or conclusion to the book of Proverbs, which it seems to be. 2. 3 requirements for righteous rule, Proverbs 31-9. Type: admonition. Chapter 30 closed with an admonition and chapter 31 opens with one. The lessons here concern kingship. As pointed out earlier, forms of the word king are used 4 times at the end of chapter 30, Proverbs 3, Proverbs 30:2728, Proverbs 31, and 4 times at the beginning of chapter 31. Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31-4. With remarkable conciseness, the mother of Lemuel describes the moral requirements of good government. These lessons are, simply put, do not use your authority as a means to debauchery. Veri 3. Keep your head clear from the stupefying effects of alcohol. VV 4-7. And use your power to help the powerless. VV 8-9. New American Commentary, note on verses 2-9. The previous admonition in chapter 30 concluded with a threefold repetition of 2 words, churning. Produces, verse 33. This one opens with a threefold repetition of 2 words, what, son, Proverbs 31:1. The point in each statement seems to be, what then, am I to tell you, my son? This is not because she is unsure. It is simply a device to call to attention, to let Lemuel know she is about to tell him something important. The phrase son of my womb is a term of endearment and closeness, intensifying the previous phrase my son and showing that she has raised him from birth. Next, son of my vows perhaps implies that she had made promises to God in praying for a son when she was yet without child. Possibly even that she had particularly vowed Lemuel, which could explain his name, again meaning devoted to God. Proverbs 30 mentioned problem women, the adulterous and odious woman, verses 20-23. While Lemuel's mother here warns her son against giving his strength to women, by which kings are destroyed, Proverbs 31:3. This likely pointed to kings amassing large harems as well as sleeping around outside of marriage, both of which could ruin rulers. Through disease, through the squandering of national wealth and distraction from state duties, through subjecting themselves to scandal, blackmail, vengeful plotting or palace intrigue between wives trying to exalt themselves and their sons, and through moral degradation leading to other vices. Verses 4-5 do not mean rulers should never drink alcoholic beverages. The warning is against excess, as shown by the reason given, to prevent interference with proper and just rulership. In strict moderation, alcohol does not impair judgment. Drunkenness, however, is another matter. There is some debate over the point of verses 6-7. Some think Lemuel's mother was saying that a king should not hoard up drink for his own use, whereby he would become drunk, but should offer it as a comfort to the suffering and needy. As God intended alcoholic beverages to cheer people up, see Psalm 4:15. The contrast with the ruler in this case would not imply that commoners are entitled to drink to excess, as other passages in the Bible show the great dangers involved in that vice. Compare Proverbs 23:29-35. Also, the idea here would not be a government welfare program of free beer and wine. The statement would instead be rhetorical, to show that a king should put the needs of his subjects above his own desires for pleasure. Other commentators, however, take a completely different view here, seeing verses 6-7 of Proverbs 31 as Lemuel's mother telling him to leave to the lowly and downtrodden the drinking away of problems, as they are already inclined to this. The point having already been made that this is simply not fit for a king, given his responsibilities. It should be noted in this regard that the word at the beginning of verse 6, often translated give, could be rendered leave. Along these lines, the New American Commentary says, the comparison to the suffering poor and to their use of alcohol is meant to awaken Lemuel to the duties that go with his class and status rather than to describe some kind of permissible drunkenness. Note on verses 4-7. The admonition from Lemuel's mother concludes with the charge in the next two verses, whereas Agur's admonition to the proud and troublemakers in Proverbs 30:32 is to put your hand on your mouth. The mother of Lemuel twice tells him, a king who is to judge righteously, open your mouth. Proverbs 31:8-9, meaning, speak out. This terminology may have been chosen to contrast with drunkenness, verses 4-5, which also requires the opening of one's mouth. Rather than open his mouth to drink and get drunk and thereby hurt the needy, a king should open his mouth to speak out to help the needy. For a king is supposed to serve his people. Given the writing down and passing on of his mother's instructions, it is obvious that King Lemuel took her words to heart. It is hoped that he came to exemplify the ideals she expressed. Yet even Solomon, the principal author of the book of Proverbs, while a wonderfully successful ruler for a time, eventually succumbed to self-indulgence and debauchery and failed in his duty to God and others. Certainly such a high degree of principled concern to rule for the good of the governed was rare among ancient Middle Eastern monarchs, and it has remained so among political leaders throughout history up to our own day. But one day a king is coming whose reign over the whole world will be characterized by perfect altruistic care for the welfare of all subjects, including an overarching concern to provide for the defense of the helpless, and those who serve in positions of responsibility under him will exercise authority with the same motivation. Type. Wisdom Poem, Acrostic Chiasmuses, NSC. We come now to the end of the book of Proverbs with a carefully crafted poem describing aspects of an ideal wife. The Hebrew word that the King James and New King James versions translate as virtuous in verse 10 is hayil. This word has the sense of strength, as it is translated in verse 3 of this same chapter. It is also rendered well in verse 29. It is elsewhere used in the sense of military valor or bravery, which we will consider further in later comments here. Yet Boaz called Ruth a woman of hayil in Ruth 3:11, the point being that she was a woman of good strong character. The sense of the word seems to be powerful and elevated. Indeed, note the description of the Proverbs' wife as being clothed with strength and honor, verse 25, with high dignity. The word rendered woman, KJV, or wife, NKJV, can mean either of these. The context here shows that she is a wife. Thus, wife of noble character, NIV, seems a good way to render the phrase referring to her in verse. We should recall earlier the same expression being used in Proverbs 12:4. A wife of noble character is her husband's crown, NIV. This concluding poem of Proverbs 31 extols that point in greater detail and literary richness. As the latter part of chapter 30 was characterized by the repeated use of a literary device, the numerical sayings, so the latter part of chapter 31 is a brilliantly structured literary composition. Who is the author of this section? Does it continue the instruction from Lemuel's mother, just as the latter section of Proverbs 30 appears to continue the words of Agur? In chapter 30 there are thematic ties between the sections. Proverbs 31 also contains such ties. The negative image of having one's strength, sapped through sensual indulgence with women in verse 3 is answered by the positive image of the poem's woman of strong character, as the righteous king opens his mouth in the cause of social justice, verses 8-9, so this honorable woman opens her mouth with wisdom and kindness, verse 26. And her focus is likewise on serving others. In its introduction to the poem of chapter 31, the New American Commentary says, while this poem apparently does not describe the wife of a king and is not addressed to Lemuel, we cannot say that it is not part of the Lemuel text. Ancient wisdom texts could combine material in a way that seems incongruous to the modern reader, and the poem could come from Lemuel or his mother. If it is not part of the Lemuel text, it is an anonymous poem perhaps added as an epilogue to the canonical text. If that is the case, it is probably fairly late since epilogues are a late phenomenon. Of course, many have suggested that this concluding poem was written by Solomon. Attribution being deemed unnecessary since he is named as the principal author of the book at the outset. 1. Either way, however, the interpretation of the text is not affected, and the significance that the canonical book of Proverbs ends in this manner remains. There are multiple layers of organization in the poem, demonstrating great skill on the part of the writer. First of all, the work is acrostic, meaning that each of the 22 verses begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Thematically, the poem can be seen to fold along the middle, as it were, with a point just before the center, between verses 19-20, serving as a seam. Note the following structure, adapted from the New International Commentary on the Old Testament. Introductio NVV. 1012. Wife's value, generally, and to husband. What she is and does. What results, body. Her cottage industry, VV. Activities, according to the seam. Her social achievements, VV. 20-27. Conclusion, her praise, from family and VV. 28-31, all. This unit, an important hinge point in the poem, serves two purposes. Verse 19 concludes the first part of the poem showing her worth and efforts, while verse 20 opens the next section, showing the results of her character. Moreover, the two verses specifically illustrate the point that her activities, work with the hands, v19, are in fact done to benefit others, to open her hands to those in need, v20. The seam at verses 19-20 is itself arranged in chiastic concentric fashion, considering the different Hebrew words used for hand and palm. Her hands she extends to the spinning rod. B. Her palms grasp the spindle. v19. Cm. B. Her palms spreads out to the poor. A. Her hands she extends to the needy. v20. On top of all this, however, is another chiastic structure spanning the whole of the poem, which places the focal point on another verse. The integration of these various structural elements is astounding. The New American Commentary gives the overlaying chiasmus and comments on it. A. High value of a good wife, verse 10. B. Husband benefited by wife. VV. C. Wife works hard. VV. 13-19. D. Wife opens hand to the poor. V20. E. No fear of snow. V21a. F. Children clothed in scarlet. Verse 21 billions. G. Coverings for bed. Wife wears linen. 22. H. Public respect for husband. 23. G. Sells garments and sashes. Verve 24. Wife clothed in dignity. Vignity. 25a. E. No fear of future. Free 25 billions. D. Wife opens mouth with wisdom and kindness. Verse 26. C. Wife works hard. Verse 27. B. Husband and children praise wife. BV. 28-29. A. High value of a good wife. VV. 30-31. The center point of this chiasmus is ver. 23, the declaration that the husband is highly regarded at the gate. The verse has been read as almost an intrusion into the poem. All the other verses praise the wife, but this verse alone focuses on the esteem the husband commands. Far from being an intrusion, however, v23 actually establishes the central message of the poem. This woman is the kind of wife a man needs in order to be successful in life. Indeed, the concentric arrangement of the noble wife's characteristics around this verse may be an allusion to her serving as the husband's encircling crown in 12:4. In short, the original intended audience was not young women, this is what kind of wife you should be, but young men, this is what kind of wife you should get. This does not mean that the poem cannot be used to instruct women, but the interpreter must recognize its primary objective. Although it may seem strange that a wisdom poem on the virtues of a good wife should be directed at young men, it is in keeping with the whole thrust of Proverbs. The book everywhere addresses the young man, my son, and not the young woman. It expounds in great detail on evils of the prostitute, and how she is a snare for a young man. It says nothing about lusty boys and the threats they pose for young women. It is a false reading, however, to suppose that biblical wisdom despises women or views them as fundamentally corrupt. This poem alone contradicts that notion. There is no double standard. The gender slant in Proverbs is a matter of audience orientation rather than ideological bias, just as Ruth, Esther, and Song of Solomon may be wisdom texts oriented to young women. Proverbs directs the reader away from the prostitute toward the good wife because its implied reader is a young man. For the same reason, wisdom is personified as a woman and not as a man. Note on Proverbs 1:10-31. As to this latter point, the Zondervan NIV Study Bible says that the poem, besides offering counsel on the kind of wife a young man ought to seek, may be intended in a subtle way to advise the young man again to marry Lady Wisdom, thus returning to the theme of Chs. 1-9, as begun in Proverbs 1:20-33 and climaxed in Ch 9. Compare the description of Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 9:1-2 with the virtues of the wife in Proverbs 1:10-31. In any event, the concluding epitomizing of wisdom in the wife of noble character forms a literary frame with the opening discourses of the book, where wisdom is personified as a woman. Introduction to Proverbs. Thus, the poem is not only a brilliant literary creation on its own, but its message and position also makes the whole of Proverbs a greater, more unified literary work. The Expositor's Bible Commentary says more about the woman here epitomizing wisdom. The theme of the poem, the wife of noble character, captures the ideals of wisdom that have filled the book. It may well be that this is more the point of the composition than merely a portrayal of the ideal wife. Note on Bible Commentary 1:10-31. Expositors probably veers too far from the practical literal sense in its assessment of the passage, since the words of the poem do not reveal it to be an obvious personification of wisdom as in Proverbs 1:8-9. But the commentary gives some good reasons for at least seeing important symbolism here and not treating the poem of Proverbs 31 as some kind of numbered checklist of female righteousness. Continuing in Expositors with some inserted comments. The woman here presented is a wealthy aristocrat who runs a household estate with servants and conducts business affairs, real estate, vineyards, and merchandise, domestic affairs and charity. It would be quite a task for any woman of average means to emulate this pattern, though the general pattern of behavior and motives can and should be followed by any godly woman. Others have also recognized that more is going on here than a description of the ideal wife or instructions for the bride-to-be. One scholar allows that this lady standard is not implied to be in reach of all, in every respect, but rather reveals the flowering of wisdom in domestic life. Another commentator likewise affirms that, as a whole, it cannot be read as a kind of blueprint of the ideal Israelite housewife, either for men to measure their wives against or for their wives to try, in all respects, to live up to. Moreover, the work says nothing about the woman's personal relationship with her husband, her intellectual or emotional strengths, or her religious activities, though it does show that her life is based on the proper fear of God. Verse 30. In general, it appears that the woman of Proverbs 31 is a symbol of wisdom, though this should not detract from some practical principles on being, choosing, or appreciating a godly wife indeed. Many commentators rightly invite a contrast to the earlier portrayals of Dame Folly lurking dangerously in the streets. She was to be avoided, and Lady Wisdom who is to be embraced. The Lady Wisdom in this chapter stands in the strongest contrast to the adulterous woman in the earlier chapters. Note on Proverbs 1:10-31. The same commentary notes more about this with regard to structure and composition. The passage has striking similarities with hymns. Usually a hymn is written to God. But here apparently it was written to the wife of noble character. A comparison with Psalm 111, a hymn to God, illustrates some of the similarities. The psalm begins with Hallelujah, Hallelujah, or Praise the Lord. This is reflected in Proverbs 131, which says, Her works bring her praise, Hallelujah. Psalm 111:2 speaks of God's works. Proverbs 113 speaks of her works. Psalm 111 says that the works of the Lord are searched or pondered. Derushim. Proverbs 113 says that she selects darashah wool and flax. Psalm 111 says that the Lord's work at Nineveh. Majestic. Proverbs 125 ascribes strength and dignity, hadar, to the woman. Psalm 111:4 says that the Lord is gracious and full of compassion. Proverbs 126 ascribes the law of compassion to the woman. Psalm 111:5 says that the Lord gives food, terep. Proverbs 115 says that the woman provides food, terep, for her house. Psalm 11:10 says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The motto of Proverbs. Proverbs 130 describes the woman as fearing the Lord. Psalm 11:10 says that the Lord's praise will endure. Proverbs 131 says that the woman will be praised for her works. It is clear, or at least reasonable to think, that Proverbs 31 is patterned after the hymn to extol the works of wisdom. Same note. Expositors and other commentaries also point out that the passage bears similarities with heroic literature, seeming like an ode to a military champion. For example, woman of valor, Ashethayel NV, is the same expression one would find in Judges for the mighty man of valor, Jibrahihayel, Judges. The warrior aristocrat, strength, Oz in VV. 25, is elsewhere used for powerful deeds and heroics, e.g. Exodus 15:2, Exodus 12:13, Samuel 2:10. Gain. v. 11, in no lack of gain, is actually the word for plunder. Food. Verse 15, is actually prey, terep. She holds, shilaha in v19, is an expression also used in military settings, cf. Judges. Surpass them all. Verse 29 is an expression that signifies victory, same note. Commentator Tremper Longman says, perhaps life's struggles here are envisioned as a war and the woman as an active and successful participant in taming life's chaos. How to read Proverbs p. 140. Longman also points out, another of the dominant themes throughout the poem is the woman's boundless energy. It is hard to believe that any single person could ever accomplish as much as this ideal woman, and perhaps the description is meant as a composite sketch. In any case, this woman is described not only as a warrior but also as a merchant ship that brings produce to port, namely her home. She also is active in commercial endeavors, not to speak of philanthropy toward the needy. Not only are her actions praised but also her qualities of mind and attitude. She is fearless about the future, wise and kind. This woman has nothing at all to do with laziness. The emphasis at the end of the poem, as one might expect, is not on beauty or charm but on the woman's fear of the Lord. Indeed, this woman is the epitome of wisdom. She is the human embodiment of God's wisdom, a flesh and blood personification of woman wisdom. p. 141. With this in mind, Expositors is right to point out, the poem certainly presents a pattern for women who want to develop a life of wisdom. But since it is essentially about wisdom, its lessons are for both men and women to develop. The passage teaches that the fear of the Lord will inspire people to be faithful stewards of the time and talents that God has given. That wisdom is productive and beneficial for others, requiring great industry in life's endeavors. That wisdom is best taught and lived in the home, indeed. The success of the home demands wisdom, and that wisdom is balanced living, giving attention to domestic responsibilities as well as business enterprises and charitable service. Note on Proverbs 31:31. A woman who fears the Lord, the wise choice. Let's now note a few more issues in the text of the passage. Verse 10 points out the rarity of such a find as the virtuous woman and her supreme value, which should be treasured, again applying to both a good wife and wisdom more generally. Verse 11, the second in the poem, is a good illustration of a poetic device corresponding to the acrostic of the passage. The Hebrew of the bet line. Proverbs 1:11 has a concentration of the letter bet. Beta. Ba leb bala wesalal lo yesar, Longman, p. 45. This was perhaps done to get Hebrew readers to take note of the acrostic pattern up front. Verses 13 and 19, mentioning the woman's textile work, serve to frame an inclusio within the chiastic structure outline above. This should not be taken to imply that women today must take on such work or start a garment business. The point is that she makes good productive use of her talents for the welfare of her household. The case given is only an example, wherein the wife uses her skills to produce items she can then trade or sell in order to acquire other goods and services for her home. And what of her buying a field in verse 16? This likewise does not mean that wives today should go about making real estate purchases without consulting their husbands. It may well be that, in the example given, the woman's household is well enough off that such investments, the purpose here being for gardening, are within her discretionary spending. Yet if this involved a major expenditure of family resources, we can rest assured that the noble wife would speak to her husband. For one of the principles of wisdom expressed throughout Proverbs is to seek counsel in making important decisions. The point of the example is twofold. 1. The husband trusts his valued wife enough to allow her to spend the household income in various ways. And 2. She takes initiative in such matters, and is thoughtfully prudent and active in doing so. Verse 15 does not mean that the woman portrayed here, a wealthy lady of the house, gets up early to personally make breakfast for the servants. Instead, she supervises preparation of the morning meal and sees to it that all have a fair share. This implies first that she cares even for the servant girls, and second that she is diligent about overseeing them. New American Commentary note on verse 15. Verse 17 shows the responsible woman keeping herself fit so as to continue doing her work and serving her family. Having succeeded so well in providing for her family, the virtuous wife is able to give to others besides, and does so. Verse 20. Indeed, this is part of the point of her work as noted earlier. Verse 21 shows the woman not fearing for those of her household when it's cold, as she has enabled them to be clothed with scarlet. The Hebrew here is shanim. Some, following the ancient Greek Septuagint translation, changed the vowels in the Hebrew to read shanaim, meaning double, the idea being that they are wearing layers. However, scarlet, denoting costly garments, might imply comfort even in inclement weather. Note the wife's clothing of purple in verse 22. The word rendered tapestry in this verse means coverings, which might refer to bedding or other clothing. In verse 25, where the KJV and NKJV have she shall rejoice in time to come, the meaning is more likely she can laugh at the days to come. NIV. That is, being armed with strength and honor. Same verse. She can face whatever the future might bring with confidence, able even to dismiss the idea that she and her family might come to destruction. In the overall chiastic structure, this parallels her being unafraid of the cold in verse 21. Verse 27 is a brief summarizing counterpart to the lengthy description of the wife's diligence in VV 13-19. Here the text explicitly states that she avoids laziness, NAC, note on verse 27. Verses 28-29 show that such a woman is praised by her grateful family. And the next two verses provide us with the summary conclusion. Verse 30 states that charm and beauty are fleeting, while real and enduring praise is for the woman who fears the Lord. Returning to the book's opening counsel, Proverbs 1:7. This woman should be rewarded with love and gratitude, Proverbs 0:31. The New American Commentary summarizes the matter well. The good wife described here has every virtue wisdom can offer. She is diligent, has a keen sense for business matters, is compassionate, is prepared for the future, is a good teacher, is dedicated to her family, and above all else possesses the primary characteristic of biblical wisdom, the fear of the Lord, looking back to Proverbs 1:7, the theme of the book. She is no less than woman wisdom made real. The riches woman wisdom offers, Proverbs 8:18, are brought home by the hard work of the good wife, Proverbs 1:11. Proverbs has, in effect, come full circle. It began by saying that the young man must embrace the imaginary ideal of woman wisdom in order to have a fulfilling life. Proverbs 1:20-33, Proverbs 8:1-36, Proverbs 9:1-6, and it ends by saying that one needs a good wife to achieve this goal. The young man has no choice but to follow one woman or the other. He will either pursue woman wisdom or woman folly, and with them he will take their counterparts, the good wife or the prostitute quarrelsome wife. He cannot attain wisdom without the good wife because she creates the environment in which he can flourish. If he chooses an evil woman, he has little hope of transcending the context she will make for him. Wisdom is not simply a matter of learning rules and precepts, but is a matter of socialization. And a man is socialized first by his parents and then by his wife. In Proverbs, wisdom is not merely or even primarily intellectual, it is first of all relational. The young person finds wisdom through 3 specific relationships. Note on Proverbs 1:30-31. With God, parents and spouse. Indeed, the arrangement of the book of Proverbs is ingenious in this respect. It commences with telling a young man that knowledge and wisdom begin with the fear of God, laying out the choice between wisdom and folly, both calling for him. It follows with a great deal of parental advice in the form of short sayings. Then it ends with a graduation, so to speak, to adult life with marriage to a godly woman who also wisely lives by the fear of God. Yet for success in life, a young man must not only choose a wise woman, he must choose wisdom itself. This then is the culmination of the book. The paramount choice presented lies before us all, men and women, young and old alike. Choose wisely, and